Welcome to the Lutheran History Podcast, where we cover over 500 years of Lutheranism. Here, we hear new stories, examine old heroes of faith, and dig into the who, how, what, and why of history making. So whether you're a Lutheran seeking to understand your faith's rich roots, a history lover, or a person looking for stories of trials, tragedies, and triumphs, you'll find what you're looking for right here. Now today, things are going to sound a bit familiar, but somehow different. It's because the tables have turned. Today, a guest host will interview me on my own presentation on a paper called The Newspaper War. It's about two influential 19th century publications that foreshadowed a major division within American Lutheranism that exists to today. I'll now turn it over to our guest to let him introduce himself.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for having me on the podcast. For the audience, my name is Timothy Grundmeier. I'm a professor of history at Martin Luther College in Minnesota. I teach courses on American history, modern European history. I did my PhD at Baylor University in Texas, where my dissertation was on Lutheranism during the Civil War era, both the theological controversies of that time period and also the political context as well. I came across Ben's work a couple years ago when I encountered his Master's of Divinity thesis on an important Lutheran figure named Friedrich Schmidt, very important Lutheran leader in the mid-19th century. I thought it was very well done. And then I saw Ben's paper that he recently presented at the Lutheran Historical Conference, which is an organization dedicated to studying the history of Lutheranism in America. That paper dealt with a church newspaper with which Wyneken was associated, but also other important figures called the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung, and all the theological controversy surrounding it. And so that paper that Ben wrote is the subject of our conversation today. And I'm just going to pause here for a shameless plug, since my fellow members on the board of the Lutheran Historical Conference would be disappointed if I didn't share this. Membership in this organization is not just for professional historians. Anyone interested in the history of American Lutheranism should really think about joining. It's a very reasonable price, only $35 a year. And with that membership, you get the annually published Journal of the Lutheran Historical Conference, in which Ben's paper that we're going to discuss today is going to soon be published. If you'd like more information on this organization, you can visit the website. It's www.luthhisticon.org. So that's www.luthhistcon.org. You can just Google Lutheran Historical Conference too. That works as well. Okay, so the shameless plug is over. And so with that bit of background, let's get into the subject at hand, Ben. Your article called The Newspaper War, on the subtitle, the Lutheran Observer and the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung fight the first open battle over Lutheran doctrinal identity in 19th century America. So before we get into the paper, maybe we should provide a bit of historical context about American Lutheranism in the 1830s and 1840s. So if I could ask you to set the scene a little bit, what are the major church organizations at this time? Who are some of the major figures? And maybe also talk about the role of church newspapers at this juncture of American religious history.
All right. Thank you for asking. So context, my research so far is really focused on really just a dozen years, about 1838 to 1850. I am aware of things that happen before and after, but I think this is a major transitional phase. And I know your research has looked at that a lot as well. But for general context, you have Lutherans in America, first British colonies in the United States, for well over a century before this all takes place. So you have a very well-established, primarily German Lutheran culture, in especially the mid-Atlantic states, not really at all in New England, but New York down through parts of Virginia. That's kind of a solid Lutheran belt, especially in Pennsylvania. Most people think of the Pennsylvania Dutch as Amish, but really they were mostly Lutheran or Reformed. But then you also have a pretty decent representation in the southern colonies and later the southern states as well. So they're pretty widespread, perhaps a little bit culturally divided from kind of mainstream American culture because of language and just because people were a lot more regional back then than they are today. So everyone was kind of regional. But that's part of the identity crisis that we see, not just transitioning from, okay, now we're in the third to fourth generation after immigration, we're starting to speak English, but also as America as a whole is becoming more national in focus. And this is a major theme for people who study the early American Republic period. Are you going to be regional or national? Politically, are you going to be a federalist who likes a centralized government? Or are you going to be anti-federalist or maybe more of a Democrat Republican mindset where we like the little man versus the big man? So a lot of the stuff that we see influencing American Lutheranism in the early 19th century and still into the 1830s and 40s is this, are you going to like a big organization or a regional organization?
Yeah, and I would add that, the late 1830s, 1840s, this is just the beginning of when newer immigrants from Germany are beginning to come to America. I mean, that's going to pick up even more so over the next decades, really reaching its high point after the Civil War. So that's also contributing to the culture clash, not only in American Lutheranism, but even in parts of the United States as a whole.
Yeah. And you have kind of, you would think the German immigrants would really bond with the German-speaking Lutherans, but in a book you pointed me to, Foreigners in Their Own Land, I read through that recently, and I thought that really helped me frame this context even better. They're totally American. They might really like speaking German, but they also really don't see much in common with these newcomers to America that are German. So that being said, you kind of have three groups in a way, and it's even more complicated than that, but you have the English-speaking Lutherans who really want to tie into the main fabric of mainstream American society, and kind of the more culturally conservative, if not theologically conservative, German Lutherans in Pennsylvania, especially. But you have some characters pop up. As you mentioned, Friedrich Winiken, my focus, he comes in 1838, and he's kind of at the very forefront of that immigration wave. And he comes as an individual, and it's interesting. He plugs himself into the established American Lutheran network kind of by chance, not really by design. But he is sent out by the Pennsylvania Synod's Missionary Society. He's interacting with the General Synod, the Synod of the West. He's just plugged himself into that network. And later, because of somewhat cultural but primarily doctrinal reasons, he will be part of the Missouri Synod, which is a newcomer synod of German immigrants primarily. But he's not alone. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, maybe we should pause here and just, it's a common name to you and me, the General Synod, the Pennsylvania Synod, and all these organizations that don't really exist anymore. Maybe we should pause and just kind of talk about what the General Synod is and what the Pennsylvania Synod or Pennsylvania Ministerium is, which factor importantly into this time period.
Yeah, so around the time my paper picks up, American Lutherans are getting ready to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Pennsylvania Ministerium, which is more of a collection of ministers, or the Pennsylvania Synod. So a congregation could also be part of this organization. That's still a little fuzzy to me exactly how that was designed, but you have both lay member participation and minister participation. And this was established obviously before the American Revolution. It was kind of the major synod, but a synod means walking together. So we're going to join together to get stuff done, maybe recommend a hymnal to be published so we can all use it together, maybe establish some guidelines, if not rules, for how do we get new pastors, how do we examine candidates for the public ministry, stuff like that. So kind of working together for larger projects. And it took a very long time, but they finally got together and made a seminary that was located at Gettysburg still to this day, but for Civil War history people, that there's a major interaction there as well. But there's the New York Ministerium. That's a larger, older group. There's a Virginia, Maryland Synod, and then there's some other groups as well. The Ohio Synod is in the early 1800s. So these are basically, it seems like every state that has a sizable Lutheran population will form a synod of more or less united Lutherans. They don't necessarily have strict criteria, though, for being part of a synod. But some people are linking more of the let's get together, the bigger the better, or at least the more unified we are as an organization, the better. And they formed the General Synod. We just kind of saw the 200th anniversary last year in 1820. A lot of Lutherans get together. Again, it's kind of more for advisory. They're not going to be telling people what to do. There's definitely a strong anti-centralized authority mindset, and a certain family called the Henkels don't like centralized control, but they also don't like some of the theological trends. So you do get some pushback against mainstream, or at least what appears to be mainstream American Lutheran developments in the early 19th century.
Yeah, and the Pennsylvania Synod or Pennsylvania Ministerium initially is on board with this General Synod project in the 1820s, but they quickly back out of it. And though they're the largest Lutheran synod or ministerium in the United States, they refused to join it until the 1850s. And so you even in Pennsylvania then will have a couple kind of breakaway synods, the East Pennsylvania Synod starting, the West Pennsylvania Synod starting, that'll align themselves with the General Synod. So, the project of the General Synod is to unite all Lutherans together under this big organization. But as you said right from the beginning, it's controversial, and not all do participate in it. Although I will say by the Civil War, so by 1860, it's something like about 2/3 of all Lutherans in the United States will be part of the General Synod. It kind of picks up steam from its foundation, the 1820s to the 1860s. One other point of context, maybe before delving into your research proper, is talking about the role of church newspapers in early 19th century America in the 1830s and 1840s. You have a great quote in your paper here from a really important historian of this period, Nathan Hatch. Maybe I'll, if it's okay, I'll just read it. Read your
please.
own paper to you. Although this is from the historian Nathan Hatch. Editors and publicists found themselves with the de facto authority among churches that favored local and democratic control. They could impart a sense of coherence and direction to widely scattered congregations. Blessed with a hungry public hungry for religious discussion, they could extend the art of persuasion and their own authority far beyond the reach of personal charisma. I don't know, maybe you want to gloss on that a little bit and talk about the role of church newspapers in the antebellum United States.
Yeah, so just broader context in general, newspapers aren't really that big of a deal, it seems, in the 18th century, but in the 19th century, especially early on, just newspapers explode. Like anyone with some spare change might say, I should invest in my own newspaper. I'll make it big. Although there are a lot of newspapers that start and then fail. But newspapers are everything. And it's kind of part of a communication revolution that's part of this era of many kinds of revolutions. But another famous historian, Daniel Walker Howe, had also noted the importance of newspapers in this period. He gave an example. I forgot the exact date if he had one in mind, but he said a respectable secular newspaper might have 5,000 subscribers. But we see the Lutheran Observer gets to a point where it has more than that. So I don't know about the timeline, if that keeps pace, but these religious papers were just even more influential than a secular paper. So just imagine the New York Times or the Washington Post being outpaced by a single brand of Christianity's newspaper and just one of those newspapers. So everyone liked to have information. You look at these different newspapers, some of them are just full of editorials. The Lutheran Observer, it isn't necessarily, it has more editions. You can get more copies a month, but a lot of it is, we'll just copy some other religious newspapers articles, and a lot of people did this. They just it was just the way you spread information. Oh, this newspaper reported it. I'm just going to copy it word for word right here. The Lutherische Kirchenzeitung is the other paper I look at other than the Lutheran Observer, and that seems to be a lot more of either Schmidt, the editor, just writing about something, or a lot of letters from individual pastors talking about specific needs and issues. So I would say that Lutherische Kirchenzeitung seems to be a bit more original, if not as frequent.
Yeah, I often tell students that they're kind of like the Forward in Christ in the Wells, or the Lutheran Witness in the Missouri Synod, or the Lutheran in the ELCA, but that's not really what these religious newspapers are like. They're very polemical, as you've pointed out. They have lots of information, not just religious information. It's not just devotionals in there. There's secular news in these papers too. There's really not a complete analog to 21st century religious publications. I don't know if you kind of get that sense too.
Exactly. Yeah. And the Lutheran Observer, I notice, is the back page is half full of ads for, a millstone or horses or whatever you want. It's a major, it's mass media. It kind of the pinnacle of mass media for the era. This is the way to communicate. And there are really no other options.
Yeah. And they're not owned, at least for most of them, until the late end of the 19th century. They're not owned by church bodies. They're privately owned. The Lutheran Observer, for example, has different proprietors that own the paper. So it's not like, again, to compare it to in the Wisconsin Synod, like the Forward in Christ, which is run by the church body. These are religious newspapers affiliated with different Lutheran church bodies. And you see this in other religious denominations as well, but most of the time they're not actually owned by the church body, which gives the editors an opportunity to really make their own personal stamp on these papers. And I think you see that in the two papers you discussed in your article. So maybe we can transition into talking about the article itself, which you titled Newspaper War. I like that title. And you mentioned these two papers already, the Lutheran Observer, which is an English language newspaper, affiliated very much with the General Synod, and then the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung. So maybe you want to introduce what's at stake in this newspaper war between these two papers. Who are the combatants? What are the issues being debated? Take it any way that you'd like to, Ben.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So I guess a little more context just for a timeline. I know we don't want to obsess about dates and everything, but the Lutheran Observer is a bit older. It predates the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung. There were, I think the first, what historians generally agree is the first Lutheran periodical in America began in 1811 with Das Evangelisches Magazin. And there are other Lutheran publications, but like you said already, kind of a personal project of someone. They might run for a year or two, then they fizzle out. The Lutheran Observer stands out, being founded in 1831, and it just keeps on going for decades after decade after decade. John G. Morris was its first editor. Morris is a guy, not to get off on a tangent, I think people could write books on him. He just kind of was an eyewitness to pretty much everything that happened, at least in East Coast Lutheranism, for half of the 1800s, and he participated in a lot of it. But he also happened to be the first editor of the paper. But he only does that for a few years. He has other interests, other projects, and then Benjamin Kurtz takes over. And Kurtz and the Lutheran Observer, they're almost interchangeable. If you have a problem with Kurtz, you have a problem with the Observer. If you like the Observer, you like Kurtz. That's just kind of the way people talk about that time period. Then later we get 1838, you get a German immigrant, again, kind of an individual coming over for his own reasons in the mid-1830s. He starts the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung in 1838. Again, as a personal project, but he takes it to the Pennsylvania Synod right away, and they approve of it. They support him. I think they agree to raise money for him a little bit. So he kind of does have some official sanction, some official connection, but he basically says the Lutheran Observer is just great. So you talked about what are the issues between the two. At first, it's the opposite. Like, how could they love each other more is kind of the question we could ask, because both papers support each other, at least say, we refer you to this paper, or we'll copy an article from this paper. Benjamin Kurtz actually sat on the committee. He was not even part of the Pennsylvania Synod. He was a guest from another synod, but he happened to be at their convention, and they said, well, why don't you chair this committee on this new German newspaper project that we really want to endorse. So he happened to be one of its founders, you could say, indirectly, at least on the committee level. So they do go several years, kind of with a maybe unspoken agreement. You just do your thing in German, we'll do our thing in English, and we won't bug each other. But we get to this thing that Schmidt kind of says it the best, I think, and very succinctly. He says the Observer is always promoting the new measures, and we are always defending the old measures. And that probably takes,
maybe that's a good place to pick that up. New measures, that's a phrase that gets used a lot, and not just by Lutherans in the 1830s and 1840s. What are these new measures that are often being talked about?
Yeah. I think what a lot of, if you're familiar more with modern church issues, the church growth movement, you might want to draw parallels, not necessarily an equal sign, but parallels between church growth and new measures. But basically, how can we get more people to come to faith? A lot of it boils down to what we call decision theology, which we as confessional Lutherans would have some pretty clear biblical reasons why that's theologically unsound, to make decisions to accept Christ when it's a gift of faith from God by the Holy Spirit, right? We are dead in our sins kind of speaks against that. As far as how can a person come to faith, we're unable to do so. But a lot of these new measures seem to latch onto this, and this is where you get the revivals. If you just Google Second Great Awakening or revivals, it seems to me that there are like 2, maybe 3 pictures that everyone uses for their book cover or for their YouTube video or whatever that show it. And it's a bunch of people falling over themselves as a charismatic preacher is somewhere in the woods in a tent or in a shack. And it's something where you are emotionally driven by an experience, a human experience, to have a religious conviction. Some Lutherans, including Kurtz, and I guess it would be helpful to introduce S.S. Schmucker, Samuel Simon Schmucker. He's a heart you can't go through 19th century Lutheranism in America without mentioning him, but he's the main educator at the Lutheran Seminary in Gettysburg. He's Mr. General Synod. He's always, even if he's not chairing a committee, his opinion always gets recorded in the minutes. He's just doing stuff, and he'll write kind of the first English language doctrine book used in the General Synod and the Lutheran Seminary. But he and maybe even Kurtz to a lesser degree might say, well, we want to have orderly worship. So they weren't necessarily adopting all the newfangled, you might say Methodist or all these other sects that are popping up. They're not necessarily going all the way into the deep end of new measures, but they're certainly saying we should try revivals. We'd really like revivals where we have a passionate speaker who might move someone to tears, and they have a religious experience. They feel their faith, which isn't that surprising. It seems as if many people had kept their pietist sympathies and attitudes from the previous 2 centuries, and they said, hey, this kind of plugs into what is happening in America today. So those are new measures, revivals, and things like that.
Yeah, that's good. It's interesting you brought up the pictures you always see when you Google Second Great Awakening. They often picture the the camp meeting revivals that are happening on the American frontier, but there's also kind of a more urban professional revivalism that's happening at the same time. That's kind of like what you said with the kind of revivalism that Kurtz is encouraging, not this kind of wild frontier revivalism where people are at the camp meetings getting struck down and jerking is one of the words using, kind of. But this is happening. This is someone like Charles Finney that's promoting this more kind of, I wouldn't say subdued revivalism, but it's maybe a more professional urban revivalism that you see in, for example, the burned over district of upstate New York, where Finney operates for a while, and other similar figures. But yeah, it really takes hold in many quarters of the Lutheran Church during the 1830s and 1840s. And so Schmidt, the editor of the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung, he's very much, would you say this is the central issue between him and Kurtz as it develops, or is there more to it than that? How would you kind of characterize their differences?
Yeah, so it, in a way, is, and even in a modern context, it's kind of hard to understand it and respect it, even if you are very sympathetic to one side or the other. He gets all bent out of shape, Schmidt does, in response to the way that Kurtz responds to an editorial that he included in his paper. And the issue at stake seems kind of silly, even today, and it seemed kind of silly to some people back then. But basically, Kurtz, as he was doing all the time, quoted a article from a Presbyterian newspaper, and to my great regret, I have not been able to find this article, even though I have copies of Lutheran Observer now, thanks to you actually on that. But I could not find the specific article, which kind of leaves me wondering, where did he get this from, or am I just not seeing it? But he didn't quote the page and month and edition or anything, so I'll keep looking for it. But anyways, Kurtz quotes an article from a Presbyterian newspaper that apparently ridicules ministers for preaching while wearing the surplice. In German, it was translated as the chorrock, so that was a translation thing I had to look into. So I don't know what the English word was used in the original editorial, but basically it's that white, sleeveless, kind of looks like you just slip it over your clerical garb, whatever you're wearing, usually a black robe underneath, I believe. And he was being criticized for that in this Presbyterian article that Kurtz decided to copy. Okay, well, what's the big deal? Kurtz copied an article that criticized a certain fashion choice, I guess you might say. Well, there's an editorial that says this is really improper. First of all, what are you doing quoting a Presbyterian article in your Lutheran newspaper? That seems a bit out of place to me. But also, we're not trying to make the point that a surplice really adds or subtracts to the effectiveness of the word being preached. But you are aware that there are pretty much everyone in Europe, and I think the line is everyone in Europe does it, is kind of the offense taken. And Schmidt, of course, is a European immigrant, so everyone back home still wears this. And then he lists a dozen pastors off the top of his head. This guy in New York wears one. The guy in Philadelphia wears one. The guy in Baltimore wears one. What must the members of these congregations think when they read your article in a Lutheran newspaper criticizing this liturgical garment that their own pastors are wearing? So kind of accusing him of maybe causing divisions unnecessarily, or kind of thoughtlessly including that article. Okay. You can see why someone might be upset about it, but is this really why these two newspapers go to war? Well, the way Kurtz responds apparently is he says, well, I didn't expect this. I didn't expect the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung to become an opponent. And then Schmidt just gets upset and says, it kind of seems like he ripped off, it just kind of released some built up pressure.
Yeah.
Like he is kind of steaming for years. Okay, we just let each other do your own thing. But then he says, well, you're all new measure, I'm all old measure. Then he just goes into all these things. Then suddenly they get quite deep, and it's all about identity and not just culture. A culture identity. Are you going to wear this garment or not? It's, you aren't really Lutheran. The teachings that you espouse in the Lutheran Observer are not biblical. They're not supported by our Lutheran confessions, and therefore you are promoting unchristian teaching, because either it's Christian or it isn't, and your teachings go against the Bible, and particularly with the sacraments like baptism, but they really get into it about the Lord's Supper. And the American Lutheran position, so kind of the mainstream, we're trying to, we're pretty much okay with what most Protestants think, and this would be in America, especially in the early 1800s, late 1700s, is dominated by Calvinism, the Reformed Church, whether you're Presbyterian or you're descended from the Puritans in New England. This is kind of mainstream theology. So a lot of American Lutherans have kind of downplayed or forgotten or ignored the distinction between the Reformed and the Lutheran teaching of the Lord's Supper. Of course, the Lutheran position is the position of the real presence. This really is Christ's body and blood with and under and in the bread and wine. All four of those elements are present, where the Reformed would say, well, it's some might say take a view of it's symbolic, or at least it's spiritually present, but it's not really there. So Kurtz would take kind of the Reformed point of view, and Schmidt, because of the surplice thing, the chorrock, went after him for it, and they go back and forth for a little bit. But you really suddenly see, whoa, we were pretending we're all Lutherans on the same page, or at least no real issues here, and suddenly there's a big divide. And it's interesting to see how other Lutherans react to this newspaper war that probably only took a couple of weeks back and forth, but it was the first battle, perhaps, in a longer war.
Yeah, and I mean, and really, this is going to become one of the key battles theologically in American Lutheranism. I mean, for the next 30 years, and it's going to morph even further, and because these issues are all intertwined on what's the status of the confessions for a Lutheran. How what does one have to subscribe to with regards to the Book of Concord, the Augsburg Confession? Can you subscribe to it in a way where you say, well, the fundamental articles of the Augsburg Confession are correct, but you can have different opinions on some points. What about the formula of Concord as well? Because these issues of the sacraments are all intertwined in those questions as well. So you've this seems like it's a paper that's the prelude to further work, but maybe you kind of talk about where you end in this paper, kind of the conclusion you reach, and then maybe you can talk about some of the issues with researching American Lutheranism in the 1830s and 1840s, sources and things like that. But if you could kind of summarize where your paper ends and what the kind of big takeaways are.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just pick up on how do people respond to this. It doesn't seem to be like this conflict between Lutheran Observer and Lutherische Kirchenzeitung. It's not like every week they're attacking each other again. And I'll just point out, both of them seem to be taking precautions not to say an individual is this, but more the position, or maybe that paper says this. And I think I can respect that. I think that's maybe part of the culture where you don't want to hand out a personal insult, because I've also read that we think today there's a lot of lawsuits for things, but back then it was even worse. So I think they maybe were trying to avoid a lawsuit, but also I'd also take their words and actions in the kindest possible way, which I think is what they were trying to do too. We're not going to break the eighth commandment unnecessarily and personally harm each other's personal reputation. We're going to talk about the issues. So I think they both somewhat handled that professionally, and but there was a fallout. They both claimed that, no, my view is the majority view. So they kind of moved away from who's right, biblically speaking. I think Schmidt laid out a pretty good case. He made a case, but then he also added, well, I think most Lutherans in America teach what I teach, and And then he listed a dozen or half dozen prominent German theologians and say they all teach this too. But Kurtz said, well, no, we are the American Lutheran Church. We're not the German Lutheran Church. And this is the position held by the American Lutheran Church, which isn't a thing. That wasn't a synod or a denomination, but it's almost like a political party. But suddenly the phrase American Lutheran is controversial. Yes, you are we are all Americans. We're all Lutherans. But to be an American Lutheran meant, I agree with Kurtz. I agree with Schmucker. And Schmidt takes issue with that. So who has more supporters? It's kind of hard to answer that question. A German observer, after Friedrich Schmidt brought news of this battle to Germany, he wrote in a private letter, well, it seems as if the Lutheran Observer seems to be in the majority just because they have more subscribers to their newspaper. But of course, people subscribe to both of them, and just because you pay for a product doesn't mean you endorse every view held by that. Right. So it's really tricky to see who's in the majority. It seems as if most people were kind of surprised by it, taken aback by it, and maybe ignorant of the finer details of this doctrine. But I think you see over the 1840s, throughout the rest of the decade, people are becoming more and more aware, whether you're an American Lutheran or a German American Lutheran or a German who has now moved to America. Everyone around the world in Lutheranism is becoming more aware. And this, I think, plays a small role in pushing people in that direction of being a little more aware of doctrine and taking it a bit more seriously. But one synod, for example, this Evangelical Lutheran Synod of the West, kind of a small synod, but they claimed pretty much everything west of Ohio was their turf, their territory. They had vast ambitions for about 10 years. But their synod president said, we cannot condone the divisive, destructive language in the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung. The Lutheran Observer is the paper of the church. It's the best. We side with them. Tell your people not to buy that Lutherische Kirchenzeitung anymore. So it seems as if Schmidt, he commented that other synods were doing the same thing. It seems like he was kind of downhearted by it, kind of got out of control, and it turned against him. So he goes back to the Pennsylvania Synod and said, well, if you think this too, I'll just resign. He offered to resign because of it. They said, well, no, you're a positive influence on the church. We support you. All the pastors support you, and we encourage our members to subscribe to your paper. So now you have synods kind of taking a stance against each other based on that. And I kind of leave it there, but it certainly sets the stage now for further debate. And this issue isn't going to go away, even if the article war fizzles out.
I think that's right. I mean, and there's going to be a whole slew of other Lutheran church papers that are founded in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, all staking out different positions on these issues of theology, but also other issues as well. So let's transition now into talking about how you go about researching something like this, Ben. First of all, I mean, how did you get started writing on this topic? And then, what kind of was your research method like as you wrote this paper?
Yeah, so I wouldn't have known about the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung. It's not actually, at least part of my education experience. It was not part of the main narrative of American Lutheran history, which in hindsight totally surprises me. So in a way, I hope this paper, this podcast, will bring it to further prominence, because you have the founder of the Wisconsin Synod writing a ton of letters into this paper. You have the founder of the Michigan Synod doing this. You have members of the Buffalo Synod, people who have formed the Missouri Synod, and of course, General Synod people. Pretty much every Lutheran group that exists has at least a major character who's involved with this paper. So again, to start off, I was just surprised it wasn't known. But the way I get into it is because as you mentioned earlier, I did research and continue to work on Friedrich Schmidt, and I basically approached him by saying, I want to gather every single primary source that exists in the world on this guy. And it turns out he wrote the first words we have in his own voice are his mission reports, some of which he directs to the members of the Pennsylvania Synod's Missionary Society, of which Friedrich Schmidt is a board member on that, so he's happy to pass on mission news in his own paper. But then sometimes Winnikin writes directly to Schmidt saying, I want this to be known to a broader audience. So Winnikin sees the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung as a very appropriate outlet for his thoughts and expressions. Another thing I've noticed too, this is maybe an aside, but in my experience of learning about Lutheranism in America, you get Der Lutheraner gets all the praise, all the credit for being the Confessional Lutheran newspaper founded by C.F.W. Walther, as if they were the first ones to attack American Lutheranism. They were the first ones to take a stand for a subscription to Lutheran confessions because, the Qantas subscription position. Lutherische Kirchenzeitung was doing that before Der Lutheraner even existed, and Der Lutheraner, Walther acknowledges that. He says, Schmidt was here before, they're doing great work. We're just going to also add our voice to the conversation. So I think it's important, but I did find for sources, the Concordia Historical Institute has some copies of this. I also found them online. You can go do some academic searches and you can find each individual issue. And I downloaded them all, so I now have that. Either Concordia or the online source had volume 6. So I found that on abebooks.com. I might be the only person in the world who owns a hard copy of that. I'm not super proud about that, but I think it's kind of cool. And I'll share that with anyone who's interested in getting a copy of that. But so multiple different ways to find this. And once in a while, you just have to buy it, which I think is kind of cool to have that history in your hands.
Yeah, I wonder if some of the reason why this particular periodical is kind of, you don't find it in a lot of major American Lutheran history books is it's kind of short-lived. Founded in 1838, ends in 1846. Do I have the dates correctly?
Yeah, it's kind of, I don't know when it actually ends. I think it fizzles out in 1847, but I think there's, I think I have volume 6, year 6, and the years don't really add up either. But yeah, it fizzles out, and I don't know if anyone has the final edition of it.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think that's sometimes often what happens. And sometimes also I think what makes certain sources, especially periodicals, more coming up more often in Lutheran history is if they're available or not. Although you found this to be actually fairly available, but I think sometimes if we as Lutheran historians and Lutheran archivists aren't getting all these things digitized. I mean, today the best way to get at some of this stuff is, well, you find it on the web, especially if it's been digitized. But it's unfortunate, if you're talking about challenges in research, actually how many of these important 19th century periodicals haven't been digitized. I mean, they're on microfilm, which is great, but who has a microfilm machine in their garage, and not even at many libraries, the microfilm machines aren't in the greatest shape. But go ahead. Were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to add to the other side. I'll be the first to admit this perhaps was not a very balanced paper in the sense of I'm trying to get both sides of view. It was more work for me, but I had, I'm able to work with German, but it's not like I can read it off the page and instantly know every word that's being said. So if I really want to understand something, I have to sit down and go through a translation process. So sometimes the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung is quoting the Lutheran Observer, but how do you get the Lutheran Observer? That's not readily available. So I had to translate it from German into English. So it'll be a good test for me to see, now that I have copies of it, how did my translation do? Did I totally mess it up? Or is it pretty true that I'm still looking to do that? But yeah, in your research, you made copies of it personally because it isn't available online. And that's shocking to me because it is by far the top 3 most dominant most important Lutheran publications of the entire 1800s. I did send in a request to a Lutheran archive and a couple archivists for copies, and I'll give them a pass because of COVID, you give everyone a pass for COVID. But,
Yeah.
I didn't get them. I probably asked a month in advance of the conference. I didn't receive a copy of the specific articles I was looking for. So before I was doing some Winnikin research, I went to Gettysburg and I sat with my scanner on my phone and I paged through the Lutheran Observer to find what I was looking for, kind of old school scan from the hard copy.
Yeah.
So that's part of that research method too, is sometimes you just have to go to the archives, which is fun, but it's not convenient.
Yeah. And interestingly, I mean, to tie this back to my shameless plug at the beginning of the podcast, one of the reasons why the Lutheran Historical Conference was founded back in the 1960s was to kind of bring different archivists and historians together to think about these projects. Except at the time, the big technology was microfilming. And so there's actually a lot of stuff done on microfilm at a lot of Lutheran libraries, but now everyone wants the better thing to have is digitized. And that sometimes some of our Lutheran archives and our Lutheran libraries are trailing a little bit behind on that, unfortunately. But it's always a manpower issue because that's time-consuming work. But go ahead. Were you going to say something?
Oh, and just on a positive note, I mentioned to one of the archivists, the former archivist in Gettysburg, about, hey, it'd be really nice to have like the General Synod minutes available. Yeah. And she responded to that, and within a year or less, suddenly, they're on archive.org, I think, and so some other minutes, I think, of the General Council in German and in English are on there. So it's not that the archivists aren't trying, but it's certainly a volume and time management challenge, but it'd be great to have that more available.
Yeah, the archivists at what's now United Lutheran Seminary, they do great work. Concordia Historical Institute in St. Louis does great work as well. It's so much. It's a lot to process. And it's hard to prioritize sometimes because there's, just where do you begin? So was there anything in your research? I mean, we kind of talked about some of the challenges here with just even locating some of these periodicals, but was there anything that kind of surprised you as you were going through this, excited you, you weren't expecting?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll go back to a challenge. First of all, who is this Friedrich Schmidt guy? Like, he's the major, Kurtz, you can find stuff out about him, but Friedrich Schmidt, for one thing, I had to put it in a footnote. There are at least 3 other, so a total of 4 Friedrich Schmidts in the mid to late 1800s who kind of are important for Lutheran history and for very different reasons. And this guy is not the Michigan Synod guy. He's not the one who is a foreign missionary. He's not the one who was involved in the election controversy in the 1880s. He's a totally unique person. He's kind of the John Smith of German Lutherans. It's just so many of them. Had a hard time finding it. Basically doing a word search through Google Books for Friedrich Schmidt and maybe do Easton, where he was based out of, or Pittsburgh. He moved halfway through his career as an editor. I got some records of his life that took a long time. But that leads into the next question, though. Some of the joys when I finally had the breakthrough and figured out, I think I found his tombstone on findagrave.com. Well, that's really cool. And then, all right, now I have his birth and death dates, at least just from the headstone, which I had no idea how old he was. Was he 80 when he was doing this, or was he 25? Turns out he was born in 1809, so he was just pretty much the same exact age as Winnikin and Walther, kind of that generation of people. So that was a challenge, but then a joy to find it. Then when I was doing search for him on Ancestry.com, someone who was a descendant of this Friedrich Schmidt happened to post a letter written by one of his granddaughters that she wrote in 1950. She was already an old woman by then. And she said, this is the story of how my grandpa came to America from Europe, and this is who he married and all that. So that was an exciting find that really pieced things together for me, just figuring out who is this person who's behind this episode in Lutheran history.
How about unanswered questions? About this, about both the paper, the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung, or Schmidt, or maybe this whole controversy as you were researching it. I mean, this is the fun part of history, but the frustrating part of history is there's just things we'll never know. Is there, because you only can follow the primary sources. Was there anything that on that front that you found?
Yeah, a couple things, and two I already mentioned, but I'll bring them up again briefly. How does it end? Why does it end? I think around 1919, Friedrich Schmidt writes about it, and maybe I'm confusing it, but there's a guy named Gottwald who writes about he kind of compiles a short history of most 19th century publications, which both of those were good secondary sources. And they both kind of say, well, it just ended. Seems to be like they didn't have enough money to keep it going. It turns out that Schmidt, he was a pastor for a while as well, but I think he starts a political paper in Washington, D.C. So he goes into kind of political reporting. He likes the newspaper thing, but he starts another. I would like to know even more about Schmidt, but the details are hazy and always kind of secondary. We don't really have anything from him explaining himself other than what you can read in the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung. The other thing is, I would really like to find that offending article about the chorrock, the surplice. I keep looking, and it's really, the Lutheran Observer is difficult to manage because it was huge. It was like 2 feet by 3 feet, something just like, maybe that's a bit too big, but it was just enormous. So when you put it onto like a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, you need a magnifying glass to read it. So that might be part of my problem. But I would like to find that article. But really, the main question that still eludes me a bit, I think I figured it out, but I was focusing on the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung so much originally because I wanted to know about Friedrich Schmidt. He starts off as kind of a pietist ish person. You might call him an awakened Lutheran. He really liked he had a firm, sincere faith in Jesus as his savior. Didn't really seem concerned about. He wasn't the type of guy to get into argument over the Lord's Supper at first, but then later he becomes a very prominent leader in the Confessional Lutheran camp. And my question was, what changed him? What turned him from kind of a generic, somewhat ecumenical Lutheran to a very steadfast Lutheran? Part of it you can answer when the Methodists started taking away members from his congregation. They kind of challenged him to learn his doctrine a bit better because they were attacking his positions. So he thought, well, I better be able to back them up. But the unanswered question is, did this one event, this one episode I talk about, is this what Winnekin took with him on the boat when he left basically that month? He left in October of 1841, a month or so after this episode. Did he read that with his newlywed wife, who was also pregnant, by the way? That must have been fun to have morning sickness and possibly seasickness at the same time. But was he trying to read through this and figure this out on his way to Europe? It seems like he definitely shared this information with everyone he met with. Did this help him form his own doctrinal outlook, which, as we mentioned, has had an impact on other things in the 19th century? So that's an unanswered question. I feel comfortable saying I think this maybe influenced Winnekin quite a bit, even though he never tells us what made him change his outlook.
So where do you see, are you kind of done with the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung? I mean, your paper ends, if I remember, about 1841. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's still quite a bit left in the paper itself. Do you have any interest in kind of following this thread on the controversy between this paper and the larger Lutheran Observer, or you kind of done with the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung for now? What's your thoughts going forward?
Well, as it turns out, one of the other, I guess he was in the audience for our Lutheran Historical Conference gathering in October. He said, hey, there's this request for book chapter proposals for a book called Communicating Religion. And I said, well, and he thought, well, your topic seems to fit in. Why don't you bring it up? So I thought, sure, an email won't hurt to the editor of this project. And now we'll be writing a book chapter that includes this issue, but I think I will expand it and talk about Der Lutheraner and the Lutheran Standard and some of these other, I'll keep maybe the time frame narrow, keep it to the 1840s again, but just kind of say what was going on as you communicate religion and now you struggle with your doctrinal identity. But yeah, talking just within the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung, after Wyneken comes back, then you have some of the people he recruited, both directly and indirectly, for the ministry. That was his mission. He wanted to collect dozens and dozens of pastors to fill the need for literally thousands of Lutherans who had no pastor to serve them. And one of them, Wilhelm Seeler, who is pretty much plants himself in Wyneken's old congregation in Fort Wayne and doesn't move for decades, but he's a major figure in 19th century Lutheranism as well. He starts sending in editorial after editorial to the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung, and Schmidt himself starts to analyze Kurtz a bit more on his book, Why Are You a Lutheran? Or Infant Baptism. So suddenly it gets into almost like we're doing peer reviews on everything our opponents say, and we're kind of tearing it apart. And you see the similar thing. August Kramer does the same, but he does it in Der Lutheraner. So I think there's definitely more, and I will be doing more with this.
Great. Maybe, I think we're about at time. Maybe a good final question is this. I mean, this discussion's ranged from, I don't know, to some pretty finer points in American Lutheran history. But I guess for kind of a general takeaway from your paper and your research into American Lutheranism in the late 1830s to the 1840s, do you see why is this relevant? Is it just we're a bunch of antiquarians here talking about old stuff because we like it? And we do. But is there kind of a wider application to this kind of ties into your communicating religion project that you're working on too?
Yeah, for me and you and many others, history in and of itself is worth doing just because it's honestly fun, it's entertaining, it's the research process can get addicting after a certain point. But no, there's more than that. There are still obviously Lutherans in America. How do we measure ourselves from this? Has this impacted where we are today in any way, or is this just an isolated incident? And I think for those who read this paper who know a bit more about what comes next, which I didn't really get into it, but there is this huge division and this split even among American Lutherans. What does it mean to be a Lutheran? How much do we have to agree on doctrine? And I think in a way it kind of brought a lot of people back from indifference about things like the Lord's Supper. And to this day, you have a division between Lutherans in different synods and different camps today. Some will definitely, maybe not in every way, but find themselves agreeing with the points made by the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung, saying, yeah, the Lord's Supper is this. It still is true today. And good for him for standing up for that. It was worth defending the truth as he saw it, especially from Scripture, and defending the truth as expressed by the Lutheran confessions. Now, we may, of course, quibble about maybe some personal decisions. Did you really have to be that harsh? Or did you really have to maybe overreact about the whole surplus thing, or maybe that was an appropriate response? That might be your opinion too. And then there are Lutherans today who will say, well, it's not all that clear. We can agree to disagree. It's not that important, which will be more of the Lutheran Observer position, who called it, frankly, it's a secondary doctrine. It's not essential to our Lutheranism. So absolutely, I think the way we view ourselves in different Lutheran camps today was kind of laid out back at this episode, and it hasn't fundamentally changed ever since then.
Thanks, Ben, for allowing me to guest host your podcast. I've listened to a couple episodes already. It's really well done, and hope it keeps going. I hope it's even longer lived than the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung.
Here's hoping. Thank you for coming on today too.